In the heart of Mexico, standing like an iron beast in the middle of barren land, there was a prison unlike any other. Its name carried a certain weight among the criminals of the nation, a place where whispers of fear mixed with stories of defiance. Puente Grande. This was not a normal penitentiary. No, Puente Grande was conceived and built as a fortress, a stronghold so imposing that it seemed less a prison and more a military base. Its very design revealed the paranoia of the Mexican state, which knew too well the caliber of the men it intended to hold within those towering walls. The walls themselves were double-thick concrete, heavily reinforced with layers of the toughest steel available. They were raised not just to keep men locked inside, but to withstand an assault from outside. Because in Mexico, when a state imprisoned the lords of the drug world, it was not unthinkable that private armies, armed to the teeth, might attempt to rip them free with bullets, rockets, and explosives. Watchtowers dotted the perimeter, each armed with heavily trained guards wielding machine guns, sniper rifles, and radio-linked communications. Beyond the towers were checkpoints, multiple rings of security barriers that stretched along the narrow roads leading in. To approach the prison meant passing through interrogation and inspection. Visitors, staff, even officials, all were scrutinized. At least, that was the design. Puente Grande was meant for the worst of the worst. Murderers, kidnappers, drug bosses, cartel leaders, men whose names were known across Mexico and even whispered abroad. Yet one name stood taller than all the rest. Joaquin Guzman Lara, better known to the world as El Chapo, the short man who commanded one of the most powerful criminal empires in human history. In 1993, after years of being hunted like a shadow slipping between mountains and cities, El Chapo was finally caught. His empire, the Sinaloa cartel, was already growing into the most feared and richest cartel in the hemisphere. Mexican authorities, with pressure mounting from their northern neighbor, the United States, had no choice but to act. When they finally closed in, after a brutal chase that stretched across multiple states, Guzman was dragged into custody. To many Mexicans, it was like watching the capture of a myth. Here was a man who commanded tens of thousands of gunmen, who flooded the United States with rivers of cocaine, heroin, meth, and marijuana, and who had brought entire cities under the shadow of violence. The government celebrated. They had locked away the kingpin. The fortress of Puente Grande would ensure he could never again raise his hand to command his empire. Or so they thought. The reality inside Puente Grande was far different than what the authorities claimed. On paper, the prison was a fortress. In practice, it became El Chapo's palace. Guzman understood something that Mexican criminals had always known. Guns and walls do not guarantee loyalty, but money does. And he had more money than the state could ever pay its officers. One by one, guards began to bend. A small bribe here, a larger bribe there. Comforts were offered. Temptations accepted. Before long, every single officer in Puente Grande had been touched by Guzman's fortune. They were no longer jailers. They were servants. El Chapo's cell transformed into a suite. Alcohol flowed where no alcohol should. Women came and went as they pleased, his wives, his mistresses, and those brought in just for pleasure. The guards turned a blind eye, or rather, they were paid to look the other way. Meals of luxury were prepared for him, not the bland prison food of ordinary inmates. And most dangerous of all, El Chapo had telephones, secret communication lines, smuggled at enormous expense, through which he continued to command his empire. Within months of his imprisonment, the truth was undeniable. Puente Grande had not tamed El Chapo. It had emboldened him. From behind bars, he was running the cartel as effectively as he ever had on the outside. That of all the men who bent before El Chapo's wealth, one stood out above the rest. His name was Damaso Lopez Nunez, known later as El Licenciado. At the time, he was the deputy chief of security at Puente Grande. El Chapo approached him not merely with bribes, but with gifts that changed a man's life. A new house, a car, cash beyond imagination, and the kind of respect no prisoner should ever command. Lopez succumbed. More than that, he became El Chapo's right hand within the fortress itself. Together, they built a bond that went beyond bribery. They became friends, allies, and eventually, Damaso would become one of the most powerful figures in the cartel itself. But inside Puente Grande, he was already crucial. He ensured that the guards obeyed El Chapo's will, that no surveillance became too invasive, that no obstacle remained in his path. Thanks to Lopez, Guzman lived like a king within the fortress. But more than that, he innovated. While inside Puente Grande, El Chapo expanded an idea that would define his empire forever: tunnels. The concept was not new. Smugglers had burrowed under borders before, but El Chapo saw the full potential. He brought in engineers, architects, and specialists. With them, the Sinaloa cartel perfected the art of underground smuggling. From Mexico into the United States, where demand for drugs was an endless gold mine, tunnels became lifelines of profit. They were not crude holes dug in desperation. They were feats of engineering, reinforced, ventilated, lit, and disguised with professional cunning. Through these tunnels, El Chapo's cartel began flooding the U.S. market with such efficiency that profits skyrocketed to almost $20 million a month. The irony was brutal. The man imprisoned for drug trafficking expanded his empire from behind bars more successfully than he had when he was free. For years, Guzman felt invincible. He had no reason to flee Puente Grande. He was safer inside than outside, surrounded by his loyal bribe guards, untouchable by rivals, running his empire without fear of assassination. But in 2001, something shifted. The Mexican Supreme Court proposed a new law, one that would allow for the extradition of high-level criminals to the United States. To El Chapo, the threat was immediate and lethal. He knew that if he were ever sent north to the U.S. justice system, no bribe would save him, no guard would bend, no tunnel could be dug. It would be the end. And so, the kingpin who once dismissed escape as unnecessary now began plotting the unthinkable. The date was January 19th, 2001. To the guards and officials at Puente Grande prison, it was just another day in the fortress. But to Joaquin Guzman Loera, the man they called El Chapo, it was the day he would reclaim his freedom. The plan had been in motion for weeks, carefully crafted with only a handful of trusted men. He knew that the fewer who were involved, the lower the risk of betrayal. Too many conspirators meant too many mouths, too many cracks for secrets to slip through. Guzman kept his circle tight, his faithful ally Duso Lopez, and a lowly, almost invisible worker named Francisco Chito Camberos Rivera. Chito was no guard, no high-ranking officer. He was a simple laborer tasked with handling the prison's laundry. His job was humble: collect the dirty clothes, load them into carts, and wheel them out of the prison to be washed in facilities outside. And that was precisely why he was chosen. No one paid attention to him. The guards at the gates barely looked at him. He had walked those halls so many times that his presence blended into the background, like the rolling of the laundry cart itself. El Chapo saw in Chito the perfect pawn, the man who could push him, quite literally, past the gates of Puente Grande. The escape plan was simple in theory, almost absurdly so. Guzman would climb inside a laundry cart, cover himself with dirty clothes, and let Chito wheel him out as if he were just another load of sheets and uniforms. But in execution, it was filled with dangers. At every gate, at every checkpoint, there were guards. If a single one decided to search the cart, if a single suspicion was raised, the plan would collapse. El Chapo would be dragged back to his cell in chains, and Chito would be dead before the day ended. And yet, the power of money was stronger than suspicion. Damaso Lopez had ensured that the guards in El Chapo's section were minimal that day. Many of them were already bribed. The rest were simply not paying attention. Chito rolled the cart smoothly through the corridors. Inside, hidden beneath piles of cloth, El Chapo held his breath, every sound amplified in his ears. He could hear footsteps, the metallic clang of gates, the distant shouts of inmates. He could feel the wheels bumping over uneven stones, each jolt a reminder of how fragile his disguise was. At one checkpoint, a guard stepped forward, speaking casually with Cheeto. For a moment, the cart sat still. The air grew heavy. Guzman could feel sweat dripping down his neck. And then, disaster almost struck. The cart, overloaded with his weight, began to roll backward on its own, drifting toward a wall. Panic surged in Guzman's chest. If it tipped, if it spilled, if he fell out, it would be over. But Cheeto reacted with lightning speed. He rushed back, grabbed the cart, steadied it, and laughed it off with a casual shrug to the guard. The man at the gate, uninterested in laundry details, waved him through. El Chapo exhaled silently in the darkness of the cart. He was still safe. Finally, Cheeto pushed the cart to the parking lot. Waiting there was a car, its trunk open, the driver behind the wheel, one of the many guards already in El Chapo's pocket. The cart was rolled to the car. Guzman slipped from a laundry into the trunk, curling into the shadows as the lid shut above him. The vehicle moved forward, inching toward the final gate. At that last barrier, the uniformed guards didn't even bother to inspect. Why would they? It was one of their own driving. They lifted the barrier and let the car pass without question. And just like that, the most heavily guarded prisoner in Mexico vanished from Puente Grande. News of the escape reached the authorities quickly, but reaction was slow. For years, Guzman had bought the loyalty of local police across multiple states. By the time the alarm was officially raised, he was already far from the prison. Federal police forces, far harder to corrupt, were mobilized. They set out on the hunt, but Guzman had already melted into the web of protection his cartel provided. El Chapo's men were waiting, their plan precise and layered. The first car drove him a short distance before transferring him into a second, armored, sleek, anonymous. From there, he was moved again and again, each transfer designed to confuse any tale that might exist. One of the last transfers took place in Mexico City itself. As Guzman looked out from inside the car, his pulse quickened. He realized he was surrounded by police cars and motorcycles. The convoy boxed him in on all sides. Had they caught him? Had the federal forces closed in so quickly? His nerves spiked. He turned to the driver, demanding an answer. "Don't worry," the man reassured calmly. "They're here for your protection." It was true. The entire convoy was made up of corrupt officers, men paid to shield him rather than capture him. Guzman leaned back, relief flooding his chest. No one would ever imagine that the fugitive they sought was being escorted by the very police sworn to arrest him. The convoy delivered him safely to one of the cartel's fortified safe houses. By the time the Mexican government admitted to the world that Joaquin Guzman Lara had escaped Puente Grande, it was too late. He had vanished into the mountains, surrounded by loyal men, shielded by money, and elevated into legend. For ordinary Mexicans, his escape became a story retold with awe, fear, and dark admiration. How could a man escape the most fortified prison in the nation? In a laundry cart, no less. The truth was simple. Walls and towers cannot stop corruption. For the next 14 years, El Chapo would remain free. 14 years in which his empire would swell beyond measure. 14 years in which cities would drown in blood as his cartel crushed rivals, seized territories, and expanded its dominance into the United States like never before. The laundry cart escape was not just a moment of freedom. It was the spark that ignited the golden age of the Sinaloa cartel. When El Chapo slipped free of Puente Grande in January 2001, he did not merely escape a prison. He escaped mortality itself. To his followers, he became untouchable, a figure larger than life. To his enemies, he was a ghost who could not be killed. And to the Mexican state, he was the single greatest embarrassment in modern history. For 14 years, Joaquin Guzman Lara ruled without chains. In those years, his empire, the Sinaloa cartel, expanded with a ferocity unmatched in the history of organized crime. At its peak, the cartel controlled a vast portion of Mexico's northern territories, the very regions that bordered the United States. These borders were more than just lines on a map. They were lifelines of commerce, arteries through which the poison of narcotics flowed north and rivers of money flowed south. Billions of dollars were at stake, and Guzman ensured that none of it slipped through his fingers El Chapo had not abandoned the idea that took root during his time in Puente Grande. On the contrary, he perfected it. The tunnels became his signature, the invisible roads that turned the war on drugs into a mockery. Underneath the earth, his engineers carved out elaborate passageways that defied belief. Some were equipped with rails for motorized carts, others with ventilation systems, lighting, and reinforced walls. These were not desperate escape routes. They were industrial-grade highways of contraband. From Mexico to Arizona, California, Texas, the tunnels opened directly into warehouses, houses, and businesses in the United States. Trucks rolled in, filled with cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine, and trucks rolled out with bags of cash. The Americans would discover one tunnel, blast it shut, celebrate the victory, and by then, El Chapo would have dug 3 more. But expansion came with a cost. Violence was the currency of the drug war, and Guzman paid with rivers of blood. Rival cartels, the Tijuana cartel, the Juarez cartel, the Gulf cartel, and later the Zetas, all clashed with Sinaloa in brutal wars for control of smuggling routes. The northern cities of Mexico, Ciudad Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, Tijuana, Reynosa, became war zones. Bodies hung from bridges, heads rolled onto streets. Mass graves filled the desert. The violence was industrial in scale, as if the nation itself had fractured into private armies serving rival lords. In this war, El Chapo proved ruthless. He outspent, outgunned, and outmaneuvered his opponents. Slowly but relentlessly, the Sinaloa cartel crushed its rivals, seizing territory piece by piece until it stood unrivaled as the most powerful criminal organization in the world. By the late 2000s, Guzman was more than a criminal. He was a myth. Songs were written about him, narco-corridos that celebrated his cunning, his escapes, his generosity to the poor in his home state of Sinaloa. To many, he was a Robin Hood figure, a man who gave back even as he bled the country. But to the authorities, he was the embodiment of failure. American agencies, especially the DEA, grew increasingly frustrated with Mexico's inability or unwillingness to capture him. Time and again, leads went cold, raids arrived minutes too late, or informants vanished before they could testify. It seemed as though El Chapo had eyes everywhere, as if the walls themselves whispered to him. In reality, the explanation was simpler: corruption. Police officers, military commanders, even politicians were bought. His money reached into the highest levels of power. By 2014, the pressure had reached a breaking point. The United States intensified its cooperation with Mexico, pouring resources, technology, and intelligence into the hunt. The new strategy was clear: stop chasing El Chapo himself. Instead, follow those around him. His family, his wives, his associates. One man in particular became the key: his Colombian technical assistant, a young man in his 20s who managed El Chapo's encrypted communications. Mexican intelligence, with DEA backing, managed to flip him. Through his access, they hacked into Guzman's secret network, intercepting messages and triangulating locations. For the first time in over a decade, they had a clear window into the ghost's movements. In February 2014, intelligence pinpointed him in a house in Sinaloa, the very cradle of his empire. The decision was made: strike hard, strike fast. Special forces, backed by DEA agents, surrounded the house in the early hours of February 17th. They stormed the front, smashing against the reinforced steel door with battering rams. Inside, El Chapo slept until one of his men burst into the room shouting, "They're here. The army is at the door." Guzman leapt from his bed, adrenaline surging. The house was fortified, but time was short. Outside, the soldiers battered the door with relentless force. Windows were too narrow, the house armored against direct assault. But El Chapo had planned for this moment. In the bathroom, hidden behind the mirror, was the key. A small pinhole allowed him to insert a device. An electric current triggered the hydraulics beneath the bathtub. With a low hiss, the heavy porcelain tub lifted upward, revealing the mouth of a secret passage. This was no ordinary hiding place. It was the entrance to an escape tunnel, dug deep into the earth, leading away from the house like a lifeline. Without hesitation, Guzman dove inside, followed by his assistant, his chef, and even his wife. The bathtub slid back into place, locking the passage behind them. By the time special forces finally breached the steel door, the house was empty. Shadows flickered across the windows, but when the soldiers stormed in, they found nothing but silence. The myth of El Chapo had grown again. He had escaped under their very noses, vanishing through the earth like a phantom. The chase did not end there. El Chapo did not flee to the mountains, as many expected. Instead, he moved to the coastal city of Mazatlan, a place so ordinary, so filled with tourists, that no one would suspect the world's most wanted criminal to be hiding there. But the authorities were not blind. His communications were still compromised. His movements still traced through the hacked network. On February 22, 2014, just 5 days after the failed raid, Mexican forces moved in again. This time, they struck a hotel called Miramar, surrounding it before dawn. Inside, Guzman slept soundly, unaware of how close the noose had tightened. When the soldiers burst in, he was caught without his army, without his tunnels, without escape. There was no firefight, no last stand. He was dragged from the room quietly, the most powerful drug lord in the world humbled in handcuffs. Photographs of his arrest spread instantly, a symbol of victory for the Mexican government. After 14 years of freedom, after wars, tunnels, and billions earned, Joaquin Guzman Lara was once again a prisoner. The capture of Joaquin Guzman Lara in February 2014 was heralded as a triumph, not just for Mexico, but for the United States as well. The DEA called it the most significant drug trafficking arrest of all time. Mexican officials declared that the myth of El Chapo had finally been broken. But myths do not die easily. After his capture in Mazatlan, El Chapo was transferred to Altiplano prison, located in the high plains west of Mexico City. Unlike Puente Grande, Altiplano was designed with modern technology, modeled after maximum security facilities in the United States. Its walls were 30 feet high, topped with barbed wire. Guard towers encircled the compound, armed with snipers and cameras. Inside, the prison was a labyrinth of steel doors, surveillance systems, and biometric checkpoints. Prisoners were monitored 24 hours a day. Their movements tracked, their communications cut off, their routines micromanaged to the second. For Mexican authorities, Altiplano was impregnable. They swore there would be no repeat of Puente Grande. El Chapo would never escape again. But Guzman had already begun to turn the fortress into a puzzle, one he intended to solve. Cell number 20 became El Chapo's new cage. It was a stark, concrete chamber with a single bed bolted to the floor, a metal sink, and a shower. A camera, installed directly above, recorded his every movement. He was forbidden visits except by his lawyers and tightly supervised family members. The guards rotated constantly to avoid corruption. And yet, El Chapo was patient. He had endured before, and he would endure again. The myth of his unbreakable power had already grown during his 14 years of freedom. To his men on the outside, his capture was not the end. It was a challenge. Their leader would not rot in a cage. They would bring him back. The plan took months to design, months more to execute. It required engineers, architects, surveyors, and construction crews. It required silence, secrecy, and millions of dollars. The goal was not subtlety, it was audacity. El Chapo would not simply bribe his way out of Altiplano. He would not slip into a laundry cart again. This time, he would vanish through a tunnel dug directly beneath the prison itself. The idea sounded impossible. Altiplano was surrounded by open land, watched by helicopters, guarded by soldiers. And yet, Guzman's men found a way that a plot of land was purchased a mile away from the prison. On the surface, it was disguised as a simple construction project, a warehouse being built on rural farmland. But beneath it, machines roared day and night. From that warehouse, workers began tunneling straight toward Guzman's cell. The tunnel would stretch 1.5 kilometers, cutting through solid earth, descending more than 30 feet underground. To keep it from collapsing, it was reinforced with wood and concrete. But this was no crude hole in the dirt. The tunnel was equipped with ventilation pipes, lighting, and most remarkable of all, a rail system. A small motorcycle, mounted on tracks, was installed to carry workers, tools, and eventually El Chapo himself. For months, the construction continued in silence. Soil was removed secretly, loads carried away at night to avoid detection. Engineers calibrated the route with precision, ensuring that when the tunnel broke through the floor of El Chapo's shower, it would be exact. The prison cameras recorded El Chapo pacing in his cell. He walked back and forth, restless, as he often did. Guard monitoring the feed saw nothing unusual. At 8:52 p.m., he stepped into the shower area, a blind spot deliberately left unmonitored for prisoner privacy. He did not return. Minutes passed, then hours. Guards grew nervous. They entered the cell. The bed was empty. The shower was empty. And then they saw it, a rectangular hole cut neatly into the floor. At the bottom, a wooden ladder descended into darkness. The tunnel had broken through. Guzman had climbed down, mounted the motorcycle on rails, and sped away into the earth. By the time alarm sounded, he was already a mile and a half away, emerging into the warehouse where freedom waited. News spread like wildfire. The unthinkable had happened. El Chapo had escaped again. The Mexican government was thrown into chaos. President Enrique Peña Nieto, who had been abroad on a state visit, was forced to cut his trip short. The prison director was arrested. Dozens of guards were interrogated. But the damage was done. For ordinary Mexicans, the escape was a joke, a reminder that their government could not hold even one man, no matter how many walls it built. For the United States, it was an insult, a humiliation of international proportions. The DEA seethed. El Chapo had outwitted them again, and this time he had done it with style that on the streets, his legend swelled even larger. Songs were written, jokes told, memes created. How could a man dig a 1.5-mile tunnel under a maximum security prison without anyone noticing? To his followers, it was proof of his genius, his destiny, his untouchable status. To his enemies, it was a warning. No matter how many walls you build, El Chapo will find a way through. For El Chapo himself, it was a second rebirth. Once more, he was free. Once more, he commanded his empire directly. But this escape carried a cost. The United States, embarrassed beyond measure, would never allow him to slip away again. They demanded his capture, and this time, they demanded his extradition. El Chapo's freedom would last only until 2016, and the hunt for him would be unlike any in history. The escape of Joaquin Guzman Loera on July 11, 2015, was not just a scandal, it was an international disaster. For Mexico, it was the greatest humiliation of President Peña Nieto's administration. For the United States, it was a slap in the face, a reminder that their southern neighbor could not control its most notorious criminal. But for El Chapo, it was triumph. Once again, he was free. Once again, he was legend. And yet, every legend must face its ending in the months following his escape. Guzman returned to his mountains, the rugged strongholds of Sinaloa. Here, among villages loyal to him, with tunnels, safe houses, and armies of gunmen, he believed he was untouchable. But this time the world was watching. The Americans poured intelligence, money, and pressure into Mexico. Drones circled the skies. Satellites tracked signals. Informants were hunted, flipped, and squeezed. Every whisper, every rumor of Guzman's location was pursued with relentless force. And unlike in the past, the Mexican government could not afford another failure. The pressure from Washington was absolute. For a man who had built his empire in shadows, Guzman now made a fatal mistake. He craved recognition. In late 2015, he arranged secret interviews with actors and journalists. Most famously, he met with Mexican actress Kate Del Castillo and American actor Sean Penn. He wanted his story told, his myth immortalized not just in song, but in cinema. To his men, it was dangerous. To his enemies, reckless. To the authorities, it was a gift. Through the communications he used to arrange the meetings, intelligence agencies were able to triangulate his movements. The walls were closing in. On January 8, 2016, Mexican Marines launched an operation in the city of Los Mochis, in the state of Sinaloa. Intelligence indicated that Guzman was hiding in a modest house there, guarded by a small number of men. Before dawn, the Marines surrounded the residence. Helicopters hovered above. Vehicles blocked every street. Then the assault began. Explosions shattered windows, gunfire erupted in the darkness, and chaos consumed the neighborhood. Inside, El Chapo's men fought desperately, but they were outmatched. Grenades shook the walls. Bullets ripped through doors. Guzman fled through another one of his infamous tunnels, crawling into the earth as Marines stormed the house. For hours, he moved underground, emerging into the sewers of the city, wading through filthy water, chased by soldiers above. When he finally surfaced, soaked and exhausted, he commandeered a stolen vehicle and attempted to flee. But the net was too tight. Roadblocks sealed the city. By mid-morning, Guzman was caught, dragged into custody by Marines with guns pressed to his skull. The world's most wanted man was once again a prisoner. This time, there would be no mistakes. Guzman was returned to Altiplano prison, the same fortress he had humiliated the year before. But now, the guards were doubled. The surveillance was constant. And most importantly, the United States demanded his extradition. Mexico hesitated at first. Extradition was a matter of pride. Handing over Guzman was an admission of failure. But the reality was unavoidable. Twice they had failed to contain him. Twice he had made the state a laughingstock. The Americans promised, under their custody, there would be no escape. That on January 19, 2017, exactly 16 years to the day after his escape from Puente Grande, Joaquin Guzman Lora was placed on a plane under heavy guard. The aircraft lifted into the night sky, bound not for Sinaloa, not for freedom, but for the United States of America. When it landed, El Chapo stepped onto U.S. soil for the first time as a prisoner. He was transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, one of the most secure facilities in the world. Here, there would be no tunnels, no bribe guards, no laundry carts, only steel, cameras, and the endless vigilance of a nation determined never to be mocked again. In November 2018, his trial began in Brooklyn. For 3 months, prosecutors unveiled the empire he had built. Billions in drugs smuggled across the border, politicians bought and silenced, rivals slaughtered, cities drowned in fear. Witness after witness testified against him. Former allies, partners, mistresses, even family members. They spoke of murders ordered, bribes delivered, fortunes laundered. The evidence was overwhelming. In February 2019, the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts. Drug trafficking, money laundering, organized crime. El Chapo, the myth who had escaped twice, who had humiliated nations, was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. Today, Guzman lives in the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Here, he spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, inside a concrete cell barely larger than a bathroom. Meals are slid through a slot. Human contact is almost non-existent. There are no tunnels beneath his feet, no allies to bribe, no guards to charm. Only silence, steel, and the weight of his own legend. The man who once commanded thousands, who slipped through the fingers of nations, who built an empire of blood and gold, is now caged forever. And yet, his story does not end in Florence. The Sinaloa cartel lives on, stronger than ever, now run by his sons, the so-called Chapitos. The empire he built continues to flood the world with drugs, to fight wars in the streets, to corrupt and to kill. El Chapo himself has become eternal in another way. His name lives in songs, in whispers, in the memory of 2 escapes that defied the impossible. He is myth, legend, ghost, proof that even when a man is locked away, his shadow can live forever.